Thank you so much for having me. It's really a privilege to speak to you all today. Many familiar faces, fortunately. I hope this will be a casual discussion at the end. But I really admire how this support group has been run for over 20 years, I just learned, and has stayed strong. And I remember speaking here very early in my career, just 4 years ago. And it's great to circle back and talk to you again, this time about a different topic. About what we know about environmental toxins and their association with Parkinson's. And I want to start the talk with, what we know, the toxins that have been linked to Parkinson's, and then what we can do through research, advocacy, changing policy, and then finally some lifestyle changes that we can all do to hopefully reduce our risk of getting Parkinson's, and once we have Parkinson's, reducing the toxins that can unfortunately make Parkinson's progress. So as Mark introduced me kindly, I am a movement disorders neurologist. I did my training in New York City, though I am a California girl. I grew up in Merced, California, and the Central Valley, which is a center of rural living, a lot of well water exposure and pesticide exposure. So some of this research hits close to home where I grew up. And after my years in New York, I came back to San Diego for my fellowship in movement disorders, which includes Parkinson's disease. And that's the vast majority of my practice, but I also treat atypical Parkinsonism, dystonia, and tremor. And at UC San Diego, I wrote a large review paper on environmental causes of Parkinson's disease. And that has led to me, speaking in various lecture forums, as well as working with the Michael J. Fox Foundation on educating and reviewing research for looking at environmental causes of Parkinson's disease. And I also have an interest in how we can modify our lifestyles, not just for Parkinson's, but for all forms of neurologic disease. So in order to understand how toxins can cause Parkinson's, it's good to go in with an understanding of how Parkinson's disease develops. So in Parkinson's, there are some key structures of the brain that help tell our bodies what to do, coordinate our movements, initiate movements, and also inhibit movements. So in Parkinson's, there's an imbalance in the ability to tell our bodies what to do and when to start movement, and also how to inhibit movements. And this is based on disease in the deep structures of the brain, which include the caudate and the putamen, and the substantia nigra pars compacta, which you can see on this slide. And as you can see in a Parkinson's brain, there is decreased dark cells in the substantia nigra pars compacta. And those dark cells are key in producing dopamine, which is an important chemical in the brain that is basically the gasoline that helps this network of communication between these deep structures of the brain tell our bodies how to move. So there's a deficiency of dopamine due to the loss of these cells. And in addition, there's an alpha-synuclein protein that is faulty and clumps and causes injury to brain cells throughout the brain, particularly these dopamine-producing structures, but also other parts of the brain that affect cognition, mood, and movement. So when we try to understand how an environmental toxin can cause Parkinson's, there's a theory called the dual hit hypothesis. This is also kind of like a two-strike theory. So the first strike, or the first hit, is someone's inherent biological risk factor predisposition. And that can be a genetic predisposition, having a genetic risk for being vulnerable to Parkinson's, or it can be something that someone was exposed to in the womb prenatally. That can be the first hit. So the first hit is being predisposed and vulnerable to Parkinson's. And then the second hit is thought to be an environmental exposure when someone is alive outside of the womb. And the theory is this environmental exposure can be ingested through the nasopharynx, so the nose or the mouth, and then progress down to the gastrointestinal tract and cause a cascade of inflammation, as well as this toxic alpha-synuclein buildup that affects the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach, the intestinal system, and then can spread to the brain via the vagus nerve. And that causes this cascade of inflammation in the brain, also in the organs, and then also spread of alpha-synuclein. And as you can see, this slide also touches on the microbiome. And there is also some theory that our balance of bacteria, good bacteria and bad bacteria in our gut, can affect our ability to process toxins and also build up alpha-synuclein. So it's a very complex cascade, but it's not just the environment, but a predisposition that can cause Parkinson's. And it's not just Lewy bodies that cause Parkinson's. It's not just the alpha-synuclein that causes Parkinson's. It's also something called oxidative stress. So that's when the energy production in our brain produces a lot of toxic byproducts that age our brains excessively. And then mitochondrial dysfunction. And the mitochondria is the energy center of our brain cells. And dopamine producing cells in particular require a high amount of energy, a high amount of glucose, a high amount of energy. So if a compound injures that energy center, dopamine cells are among the first to go, the first to be injured. So it's this cascade of three main elements that can cause Parkinson's. So now I want to go into the compounds that have been found to be correlated and perhaps causally associated with Parkinson's. And as a group, pesticides have been targeted and identified through large epidemiologic studies. So epidemiologic studies are studies where they look at people's occupations, demographics, which include race, age, where they live, and certain factors, and see if there are trends that can be picked out. And there was a very large seminal study in the 1990s called the American Agricultural Health Study. And it looked at farmers in the Midwest, and the farmers were able to answer questionnaires about what pesticides they used. And in this seminal study, rotenone, paraquat, and maneb were identified to be significantly associated with Parkinson's. And of course, finding an association doesn't necessarily mean it's causal. So they had to look beyond to see, does this pesticide actually cause Parkinson's? And I'm just going to go through each pesticide one by one. Rotenone is actually an organic pesticide. It's generated from plants. It was used by Aboriginal peoples to actually catch fish. By using this toxin, they were able to poison the fish, allow the fish to float at the top of the reservoir and eat. So it's an organic pesticide, surprisingly enough, but it is toxic to brain cells, particularly dopamine producing cells. And farmers who used rotenone were found to have a higher risk of Parkinson's disease. And it has since been banned as an insecticide in agriculture. Also in animal studies, to create animal models of Parkinson's disease, rotenone is very well established. If you expose an animal to rotenone, they develop a Parkinsonian disease. And it's actually an animal model that's used to test treatments for Parkinson's at this point. And the way rotenone can cause Parkinson's is it affects that energy center, the mitochondria of the dopamine cells, and it's toxic to those cells, but it's not just toxic to dopamine cells, it's toxic throughout the brain, including peripheral nerve cells. So the link between rotenone and Parkinson's is well established. Unfortunately, it has been banned, but concerningly, it's still being used in the United States to kill fish. Surprisingly, when I was refreshing my literature review for today's talk, I found that rotenone was used in San Francisco as recently as 2014 to kill an invasive species of fish in Mountain Lake. And it's also used throughout the country on a case-by-case basis to kill fish in lakes. And I did some reading to see, it was very well publicized. It didn't seem to be something that the county was trying to hide or conceal, but I couldn't find any open disclosures about how they were going to make sure rotenone was detoxified and safe for people to enjoy the lake, because often people go kayaking, and then also in lakes around the country, people go fishing in lakes that rotenone has been used in. And unfortunately, I didn't find any clear documentation in San Francisco that they had neutralized rotenone, and it can be neutralized, so I certainly hope they did, and that they had really looked into the implications for Parkinson's and other neurotoxic effects. So unfortunately, though rotenone is banned in agricultural use, it's still being used as a pesticide or to kill fish. So that's important to keep in mind. And then paraquat and manab is synergistically used, well, often used together to kill grass and weeds. And it's very inexpensive. And the way it may cause Parkinson's is that paraquat increases oxidative stress, those free radicals that can rapidly age brain cells. And similar to rotenone, it's been reproduced in animal studies to cause Parkinson's. So there's no question that high doses of paraquat can cause Parkinson's. I think more of the question mark is, do our environmental exposures, are they at the level to cause Parkinson's? And clearly people who, before this was known, use paraquat without the proper protective equipment, so professionals, farmers who use paraquat and manab, they were more at risk for developing Parkinson's. So now it's restricted to only commercial and professional use with the appropriate protective equipment. But it has been banned in the European Union and is still in use in the United States. And it's also widely used in third world countries because it's a very inexpensive grass killer. And this is very concerning to a lot of Parkinson's specialists for many reasons, because we do suspect that paraquat can still get into well water, can still get into food sources, can still even be in the environment. And certain areas, like where I'm from, the Central Valley, which is very agricultural, has been shown in epidemiologic studies to have a higher incidence of Parkinson's disease. So there is an active campaign to actually ban paraquat from the US. And later in the presentation, I'll go over some campaigns to address this. Then organochlorines is another pesticide that is also, the couple examples that you might know of is DDT and dieldrin. And DDT, a lot of us have heard the term, but are not exactly familiar with what it is. So DDT, the inventor of DDT actually won a Nobel Prize because DDT is a very powerful mosquito killer or insecticide. And mosquitoes posed a huge threat to society because it was a transmitter of malaria. So it saved many lives to use DDT. However, in the 1970s, it was revealed that DDT has very toxic effects in animal life and stays in animal life for a very long time. It accumulates in the fatty tissue of animals. And there was a book called The Silent Spring that alluded to the fact that birds were dying because of the accumulation of DDT in the environment. And it's really affected the reproductive systems of animals. So fortunately, DDT is largely out of use, but it is still used in certain regions where mosquitoes are very prevalent and the risk of malaria is very high. So I'm very relieved that organochlorines are much less used, but they are still used here and there. And it's important to be aware that certain life-saving insecticides can still have risk. And then finally, the last compound I'm going to cover is organophosphates. And I have to admit the research here is not as robust, but this is simply a type of pesticide that can be used and used to be used in household gardening as well as agriculture. Now it's largely fallen out of favor for households, but is still being used in professional use. And studies looking at the Central Valley in particular and measuring ambient pollution, so air pollution, and the content of organophosphates in the air, that higher level was found to be associated with Parkinson's. And in addition, some researchers at UCLA found that people who carried a certain gene that did not detoxify organophosphates as well were additionally at risk. So that was, case in point, that dual hit hypothesis I mentioned, that sometimes certain genes can make someone more at risk for these outside pollutants and toxins. So fortunately, a lot of us know about these toxins and the government is aware and policies are being changed. But we have to be aware that pesticides are not only just if you're a farmer or a gardener, but if you live in a rural area, if you consume well water, if you consume produce, we are at risk for being exposed to pesticides. And there needs to be more data on how casual exposure through eating produce, does that put us at risk for Parkinson's? That does need more study. And I don't want everyone to be super scared about eating vegetables right now. We want to eat produce. But given that Parkinson's is being understood as an industrial disease, Parkinson's only became discovered in the late 1800s and early 1900s, coinciding with the Industrial Revolution and the onset of mass agriculture and use of pesticides. There's a growing school of thought among really respected neurologists, from Michael O'Kuhn in Florida to Ray Dorsey in upstate New York to Jeff Bronstein at UCLA, that we think Parkinson's disease is increasing in rate, not just due to aging, due to our society getting older, but also because of the widespread use of pesticides and industrial compounds. One example of this is China is rapidly industrializing and has a high rate of pollution. And China actually has the highest rate of Parkinson's disease developing now in the world. So we are seeing these associations, and us neurologists are learning that we have to acknowledge these links. And then another compound that I haven't really touched on, but does involve occupational exposure, is manganese. So there's two distinct syndromes that can happen from manganese. There's acute poisoning, like intoxication from battery fluid exposure or an industrial accident. And manganese has very high uptake into the brain, into those basal ganglia, and is very toxic to dopamine producing cells. You can actually image manganese in these acute poisonings and it'll show up in the brain in the basal ganglia. And that causes an acute Parkinsonian syndrome. That's not Parkinson's disease. So that's a little different than what I'm talking about here. But what I'm trying to allude to here is people who have low-grade exposures of manganese over many years during certain occupations such as welding have been found to be at higher risk of Parkinson's. There was a study that was published in the Neurology Journal just a few years ago that followed welders and asked them to say what tasks they did. And the researchers were able to correlate from those tasks how much manganese they approximately were exposed to based on the actual metals they were working with and the equipment they were using and what they were doing. And these were, manganese, these were welders in the US with appropriate environmental precautions, appropriate equipment, and all of the manganese exposure they were supposedly exposed to was well below the regulations for occupational health. So it was thought to be safe what they were doing. But unfortunately, in these studies looking at welders for over a course of 10, 20 years, there was an association with manganese exposure and a higher risk of Parkinson's in welders. So this is still a new area of research, but it is of concern that metalworking is a risk factor. And then moving on to industrial compounds. So polychlorinated biphenyls, also called PCBs, were used widely in the 1930s and the 1970s in industrialized countries because it's a fatty, synthetic, oily compound that was used in engines and capacitors. And PCBs have been found in a higher quantity compared to people who didn't have Parkinson's, looking at the brain of people in Parkinson's disease. So when we looked at, not me, but when researchers looked at brain tissue, they found that PCBs had a higher amount in Parkinson's postmortem tissue compared to non-Parkinson's individuals. And unfortunately, even though PCBs are now banned, they also last in the environment for a very long time. They've been found in high concentrations in fish and large mammals. And there's a concern that certain societies like the Inuit, who eat a lot of mammals, eat a lot of whale meat, will be at risk for accumulating more PCBs and Parkinson's disease. On the other hand, there have been some negative studies saying that PCBs are not associated with Parkinson's. So the data is a little bit mixed, but it's still a compound of concern. The last compound I'm going to go over is something called trichloroethylene, and it's a degreasing agent that had been used in factories to clean equipment and degrease. And unfortunately, when it was being used, people who worked in factories actually were being exposed to TCE, using TCE on their bare hands. They were using it without protective equipment, dipping equipment in and out of TCE, and there were studies that showed that they were at higher risk of getting Parkinson's. And unfortunately, it's not just people who work with TCE who are at risk, but there are well-established cases of TCE running off from factories, getting into water supply, and affecting local communities, including Camp Lejeune, which was a military site. So that was well documented. I believe that there have been lawsuits filed about Camp Lejeune because TCE does also cause cancer, in addition to Parkinson's. But this has been kind of a shame for the US government, and is something that we should be aware of, that our water supply can be contaminated due to nearby factories. So of course, this is very concerning. I'm sure, in this group in particular, when you're already afflicted with Parkinson's, it can be very jarring and in fact traumatizing to know that there are compounds in the environment that may have caused this disease. And it's not a clear one leads to two. It's definitely a cocktail of insults and predisposition that causes Parkinson's. But what can we do to protect ourselves and to protect our children and future society? So what's really important is to identify the problem, to really promote and support research that looks at the risk factor for Parkinson's and how it starts. Because only if we identify the source can we actually get better treatments and better prevention. I'm also going to go into certain advocacy and policy initiatives that are underway to help reduce pesticide exposure and improve environmental health. And then finally, on an individual level, there are lifestyle changes we can make to improve our brains, to help reduce oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction. And hopefully you can walk away from this talk feeling educated, a little upset, but also empowered on things that we can do to help ourselves and help society. So the California Parkinson's Disease Registry is a really exciting initiative that started a few years ago in 2018. And the primary brain behind this is Dr. Carolyn Tanner, who's probably spoken at this group before. She's at UCSF, and she is one of the seminal early authors of those agricultural studies looking at the link of pesticides and Parkinson's. And with her help, the California government has established this registry where we doctors, we providers are required to report every person we treat with Parkinson's disease. So every new diagnosis and every case we're treating. And I know this sounds really simple, but if we can just know how many people we have with Parkinson's disease and where they are in the state, this can really help us target environmental health and environmental modification, because we can look at specific regions in California, see where Parkinson's is clustering. I already mentioned the Central Valley is unfortunately a cluster. See, how gender plays a role, how race plays a role, how occupation plays a role, how environmental toxins play a role. and really just disentangle and understand more on how we can prevent this terrible disease. And then there are campaigns underway that I encourage you to check out. The Michael J. Fox in particular is actively funding research looking at and identifying occupational and environmental exposures, and they're linked to Parkinson's. There's also an active campaign that seems to have a lot of momentum with lawmakers to ban paraquat. And then Consumer Reports also has a petition to help pressure the Environmental Protective Agency to prevent and limit pesticide use. And then finally, it's important, if anyone has political connections, if you're ever at a political gathering, to really encourage our lawmakers to fund Parkinson's research more aggressively and devote more money for the NIH to investigate Parkinson's disease. Because given how many people are affected by Parkinson's disease, I still consider Parkinson's disease research to be relatively underfunded compared to other diseases. So finally, I want to shift our focus to what we can do as an individual in our lifestyle. And this is a relatively new area of research, even newer than finding if pesticides are linked to Parkinson's. But there are really great studies, including one that was just published this year in our neurology journal about certain diets being linked to a lower risk of early Parkinson's, also known as prodromal Parkinson's. So this is a study looking at healthcare workers, primarily nurses, asking them to fill out surveys on what kind of diet they eat. And following the Mediterranean diet, and then another diet I'm going to show on the next slide, was linked to having fewer signs of early Parkinson's disease. So again, this study is really new, but it is encouraging that perhaps certain ways that we modify how we eat can reduce the risk of Parkinson's. And actually, in terms of cardiovascular health, preventing heart disease, preventing stroke, preventing diabetes, these diets are very well established to work for those. So we have much to gain if we consider these diets. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the Mediterranean diet. So the foundation, which Mark actually talked to earlier in the talk, earlier before we started our lecture, was how being social is really important in the Mediterranean lifestyle and actually considered to be part of the Mediterranean diet. So nurturing social connections, having meals with others if you can, obviously in a safe setting with the pandemic, is really important in Parkinson's disease and also in this diet plan. And being physically active is also important, and I'll talk about that more later in this presentation. And then basing our meals around vegetables, fruits, whole grains, olive oil, beans, nuts, legumes, seeds, herbs, and spices really should be the base of our meal. And then at least twice a week, if you are a seafood eater, enjoy some seafood. In more moderate portions, we should be eating poultry, eggs, cheese, and yogurt. So really once a week or twice a week. And then less often red meat and sweets. Water is really important. I can't say that enough. Dehydration can really cause confusion, low blood pressure, falls. So drinking water is great. And on the note of this talk, in the theme of this talk, it wouldn't hurt to have filtered water to make sure our water is clean and healthy. And then in moderation, one can have wine. But I have to be honest, I know you're all up in wine country, so the definition of moderation, can vary from person to person. But the studies that I read was actually saying, 1 ounce of wine for a woman and 1.5 ounces of wine for men a day. So very, very conservative doses. So if you don't drink wine, don't feel badly. The dose of wine we're talking about here is very low. And of course, if you do enjoy wine, I would enjoy it in moderation. And then here's another diet that was designed by the Harvard School of Nutrition. And this was kind of Harvard's response to the old food pyramid all of us probably learned, 10, 20 years ago. And they found that food pyramid was not very effective. So they decided to take a deep dive into nutritional research and formulate this alternative healthy eating index. And this is much more evidence-based, and this is a diet that is very well established in reducing the risk of heart disease and stroke and diabetes. And this is just another diet similar to the Mediterranean diet that involves eating less meat, not putting vegetables and fruits on the same level. Vegetables are actually healthier than fruits. And in the study I mentioned, the Mediterranean diet and this alternative healthy eating index was found to have a reduced risk of those early signs of Parkinson's disease. And then, all these diets say eat vegetables, eat fruit. And then earlier in the talk, I said pesticides help us grow fruit and vegetables. So how do you reconcile that? So there are pretty good articles on the internet. This is from Consumer Reports and the Environmental Working Group about produce that is considered clean, that you don't necessarily have to buy organic because there's a low accumulation of pesticides on these foods. So the Clean 15 includes asparagus, broccoli, cabbage, kiwi, cauliflower, mushrooms, honeydew melon, cantaloupe, avocados, all delicious foods. Unfortunately, if you're on a budget, you don't necessarily have to spend and buy organic. And I think it goes without saying that you should wash your fruits and vegetables really well to reduce your exposure to pesticides and bacteria even. And the next slide is the dirty dozen. So these are ones that you do want to purchase organic. So I love these vegetables, and I actually reminded myself, oh my gosh, I have to buy organic spinach, organic greens, nectarines, cherries, peaches. All of these wonderful summer vegetables and fruits actually have a high use of pesticides. So it's important to spend the money here and buy organic. And those of you who are gardeners, I know spinach and kale grows really easily in my mom's garden. You can try to garden organically. So more notes about diet. I know many of you are familiar with the effect that protein has on your absorption of Sinemet, Parkinson's medication. So it is important to time your medication separate from protein. I usually tell patients to have their medication at least 30 minutes before meals or an hour or two after. But that doesn't mean you have to avoid protein altogether. It's just the timing of the protein. So I know all of you know how your bodies work, but I just want to say that the research says that you don't have to follow a low protein diet. And then in terms of supplements, I'm not a huge supplement person. I really advocate having just a multivitamin, vitamin D, those calcium, those are really the main vitamins you need to take. I don't advocate taking large doses of resveratrol, green tea supplements, beta carotene. It's really best to get that from plant-based sources. But having it in its natural form, green tea, vegetables, grapes, which contains resveratrol, is by all means encouraged. And then I know I'm not the first neurologist who's told you to exercise, so I won't belabor this point too much. But we know that exercise helps our brains produce neurotrophic factors. So those are healthy chemicals that help our brains produce more neurons and fight oxidative stress and aging of the brain. It stimulates that dopamine synthesis when dopamine is really important for our movement, our mood, and our cognition. And there's very strong evidence time after time that exercise helps improve strength and balance and quality of life in Parkinson's disease. And what's interesting is it's not just zoning out on a treadmill or zoning out on a stationary bike that's helpful. It's really something that engages your mind, and that social can be very helpful. So things like Rock City boxing, Feldenkrais, Qigong, dance, it involves you using your brain to tell your body what to do. And that's the connection that breaks down in Parkinson's. So if you've exercised that reconnects that mental body connection, that specifically has been shown to slow down Parkinson's disease. And then cycling, I know I just said, sitting on a bike and zoning out doesn't really help, but interval training or training in a Peloton class or with a coach, that has been shown to help slow down Parkinson's disease. There's a researcher in Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Jay Alberts, who cycled with his friend who had Parkinson's, and they were on actually a tandem bike. So it meant that his friend who had Parkinson's disease had to unfortunately keep up with him, and they would interval train together. And he instantly noticed that his friend had better Parkinson's symptoms. So then he created a study looking at cycling. And I think he's even collaborating with Peloton. But yeah, cycling, especially interval training or in a class session, can help slow down Parkinson's. And then I've gotten a lot of questions about this over the years about light therapy. And light therapy actually comes in different forms. There's light therapy where you just have a bright light lamp. And that's what this study, Pause et al. Found, that if someone was exposed to bright light every day just for a few minutes, they had improved Parkinson's disease quality of life and symptoms. And then there's red light therapy, like a red light helmet. And I haven't found a lot of strong studies that. Interestingly, there's a more invasive study underway now looking at using light planted in the brain to help protect dopamine neurons. And it's really questionable how this works, but I guess in animal studies, particularly in monkeys and rats, it's been shown that if you shine a light on neurons, they're more resilient. They don't die off as quickly. So this is an area of study that's very interesting with some encouraging results, but it really needs a lot more study, particularly the electrode version where they implant light in the skull, because that's very invasive. So early phases of study right now, but some encouraging data. And music therapy is another great alternative for people who are not a boxing type. I know many patients who are not. So engaging in singing, voice exercises, dance is really helpful. And Kaiser actually has a collaboration with the San Francisco Ballet, where they have a weekly class where you do dance and some vocal work. So I definitely encourage that. That's free of charge to anyone, not just for Kaiser patients. And then if I believe in Sonoma, there are some local groups as well. I'm sure with the pandemic, a lot is on hold, but if you enjoy music, I encourage you to continue engaging in it. And then not helpful. So unfortunately, acupuncture has not been found to be helpful in Parkinson's disease. I think acupuncture may help with pain symptoms, but it's not actually shown to help slow down Parkinson's or improve symptoms. I know I have a patient who is trying out whole body vibration, and I think there needs to be more research on this topic. And then iron or chelation therapy. So I didn't really mention this earlier on, but there is a high accumulation of iron in the brain in Parkinson's disease. And some people have theorized maybe reducing iron will help reduce iron deposition in Parkinson's. And this is not proven to work. So that's basically the bulk of my lecture. So I'm just going to wrap up. I want to remind you that working at Kaiser, I always strive to give patients the best care. And I work with a wonderful team. In Kaiser Santa Rosa, we have some wonderful physical therapists, Allison Lowe, Kendall Kagawa, and then we also work closely with speech therapy, particularly Claudia Morelli. So we really try to have a teamwork approach with our partners and your care team. Also some excellent neurologists up in Santa Rosa that routinely talk to me about how to better care for their Parkinson's patients. So if you have a neurologist in Santa Rosa that you don't want to give up, I don't question that, because they're really great. And we try to train all of our neurologists to take good care of Parkinson's patients. And then we also are careful about the drugs we include in our formulary. Every drug that is FDA approved for Parkinson's disease, we review and we can prescribe. So I want to assure you that we are looking at the newest drugs as they come out. And I encourage you to check this website out called Parkinson's Care at kaiserpermanente.org. It's a partner site that we have with Kaiser Southern California about resources for Parkinson's disease care. And we also have a growing interest in culinary and lifestyle medicine, which I think it's in its infancy in terms of neurology. But I also know one of my patients in Santa Rosa is really into a plant-based diet lifestyle. And there is a plant-based diet class up in Santa Rosa that teaches how to cook in that diet. So if you like cooking, there are cooking classes and recipes at Kaiser that can really improve your health.